Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am very grateful for the opportunity to put a few words on the record concerning Bill C-7, an act to amend the Criminal Code, Medical Assistance in Dying, which I will refer to as M.A.I.D throughout my remarks. This bill from the Liberal government amends the original M.A.I.D legislation that achieved royal assent only 4.5 years ago. This new bill was initiated in response to the Truchon case, where a federal court in Quebec struck down the clause in the original legislation that said M.A.I.D could only be applied if natural death was reasonably foreseeable. The Quebec Superior Court judge ruled on September 11, 2019, just over a year ago, that this clause violated Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, making this clause of the original legislation unconstitutional. The court's ruling will come into effect on December 18th of this year. Conservatives have held firm to the position that this ruling by the Quebec Superior Court should have been appealed by the federal government to the Supreme Court of Canada. Given that it is a ruling that affects life and death, I sincerely agree with our position. Had the Liberal government appealed, it would have given Canadians significantly more time to discuss this very critical issue. And had the Liberal government not prorogued Parliament for 6 weeks in August and September, Parliament would have had more time to study and debate this bill. But this position was resoundingly ignored by the Liberal government. Now we are voting on a radical expansion of M.A.I.D, and I have many concerns and will not be supporting this bill. But what I'd first like to say is that I do understand the desire for legalizing M.A.I.D in Canada. I witnessed my grandmother suffer terribly at the end of her life. M.A.I.D was not made available to her, and frankly, I don't know if she would have chosen it. She was a very strong and resilient woman with a gift of the gab and an incredible ability to write, which I think I have inherited those gifts, which is why I'm able to be here today as a member of Parliament, which she really would have been so proud to see. And she had these abilities despite not even having a great education, and she would have achieved, I believe, amazing things had she not been born into a very poor family in rural Manitoba. And she tragically suffered a stroke, and after that she couldn't speak or write her favorite things, and then her diabetes wreaked havoc on her body, and her leg had to be amputated as a result. And then a short while later, the doctors told us that they would have to amputate her other leg. It was really horrible and really the worst thing in my life to see her go through this. And I wonder if M.A.I.D would have been a kinder option for her. And for that reason, I understand and deeply appreciate why M.A.I.D was legalized in Canada. However, Conservatives have flagged a number of critical issues with this new expansion of M.A.I.D, and we worked hard to bring forward amendments to ensure safeguards remained in place for Canada's most vulnerable people. Unfortunately, the Liberals voted against every single one of our proposed amendments. Yeah. And I really don't understand why, Madam Speaker. We presented many strong, sound arguments from stakeholders across the country, most of which had no partisan connection whatsoever to the Conservative Party. And in fact, I believe this is not a partisan issue, and yet is being treated like one by this Liberal government, which I find, frankly, deeply upsetting. And when I was researching this bill to determine my position, I was startled to discover that over 1,000 physicians had written to the Attorney General in opposition to this bill. And I'd like to read into the record some of what their letter said because I found it extremely compelling. They said, "This bill expanding medical assistance in dying M.A.I.D to virtually everyone who is sick and suffering in Canada will, if passed in its current form, make our country the world leader in administering death. As medical doctors, we feel compelled to voice our dismay. The shock of a sudden illness or an accident resulting in disability can lead patients into feelings of anger, depression, and guilt for requiring care, emotions that, with support, proper support and attention, can resolve over time." They went on to say the care and encouragement shown by physicians may be the most powerful force in overcoming despair and providing hope. Unfortunately, patients can no longer unconditionally trust their medical professionals to advocate for their life. When they are at their weakest and most vulnerable. Suddenly, a lethal injection becomes part of a repertoire of interventions offered to end their pain and suffering. And finally, they went on to say, Bill C-7 would allow those who are not dying to end their lives by a lethal injection at the hands of a doctor or nurse practitioner. Shockingly, most of the safeguards that Parliament deemed necessary in 2016 to protect the lives of vulnerable individuals from a wrongful death are being removed. Under the new bill, an individual whose natural death is considered to be reasonably foreseeable could be diagnosed, assessed, and euthanized all in one day. We are very concerned, they wrote, that removing the 10-day reflection period and other safeguards will lead to an increase in coerced or tragically unconsidered deaths. The reckless removal of safeguards previously deemed essential will place desperately vulnerable people directly in harm's way and may cost them their lives, end quote. And these comments tie in very well with what we've heard from the disability community at the Justice Committee and the like. When we were studying this legislation, in fact, 72 national disability advocacy groups opposed this legislation, and I personally fielded many calls from my constituents who, frankly, were the first to tell me that they usually vote NDP, and yet they felt very compelled to reach out to me to express their fear of what this bill meant for them. There is a genuine terror in the disability community of this bill that I have heard firsthand, and yet those fears are being completely discounted by this Liberal government. And I really don't understand why, frankly, Madam Speaker. And more than that, the Liberals are even ignoring the United Nations with this legislation. A UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities responded to the expansion of M.A.I.D. with clear dismay. She said, quote, "I am extremely concerned about the implementation of the legislation of medical assistance in dying from a disability perspective. I have been informed that there is no protocol in place to demonstrate that persons with disabilities have been provided with viable alternatives for eligible for assistive dying, and have further received worrisome claims about persons with disabilities in institutions being pressured to seek medical assistance in dying and practitioners not formally reporting cases involving persons with disabilities." And she went on to finally say, "I urge the federal government to investigate these complaints and put into place adequate safeguards to ensure that persons with disabilities do not request assistive dying simply because of the absence of community-based alternatives and palliative care," end quote. I think that's a pretty powerful quote in my opinion. And we know that there's considerable issues with palliative care. We know that 70%, which 7 out of 10 Canadians, I find this a shocking number really, I had no idea until I did the research for this bill, 70% of Canadians do not have access to palliative end-of-life care in Canada. And I do believe that without access to good quality palliative care, we have failed to offer Canadians a real choice. If you can't peacefully live out your final years with moments with safe, reliable care that's supportive, that's catered to your needs, then I can understand why M.A.I.D. would be so appealing. And more than that, the COVID-19 pandemic has really lifted the veil on the terrible state of elderly care in Canada. In Winnipeg, our residents of elderly care homes have suffered tremendously. And while we have many care homes that are doing phenomenal, outstanding work, others not so much. A few weeks ago, Manitobans were horrified at revelations of an elderly care home just outside of my riding that was understaffed and overwhelmed by COVID-19 cases. And when paramedics arrived, they found some residents had been dead for hours and no one knew. Others were severely dehydrated and literally starving to death. Mr. Speaker, if we are to provide, Madam Speaker, pardon me, if we are to provide dignity in dying, we must also ensure dignity in living. This is paramount to the discussion and has been completely ignored by this Liberal government. And in fact, their 2015 election platform, they promised billions of dollars for palliative care, and this was never delivered. Further to that, I found it alarming that the 10-day reflection period in the original M.A.I.D. legislation will be eliminated with the passage of this bill. It is important to note that the existing M.A.I.D. legislation allowed the 10-day reflection period to be waived under special circumstances. So flexibility already exists in the existing M.A.I.D. framework on this 10-day reflection period. That being said, I'm really not married to the 10 days specifically. It could be a bit shorter, it could be a bit longer. I would need to hear from professionals in psychology to truly understand how many days are best to ensure end-of-life decisions are not emotionally made or in the heat of the moment, so to speak. But I do firmly believe, at the very least, very, very least, someone who requests M.A.I.D. should have to sleep on it. Given that there is no going back from it, and given tough days, whether someone had a poor interaction with a healthcare worker, or they don't like their new room or facility, or their family hasn't visited it in a while, or it's just been a tough physically or emotionally painful day, there are so many reasons why someone who, when in their most vulnerable state, should have the safeguards in place when making life-ending, game-over decisions that would get, with this legislation, if it's passed, that could get administered only hours later. And you know what really solidified my thoughts on the removal of this safeguard, Madam Speaker, is the former Liberal Minister of Justice, the member from Vancouver Granville, who was responsible for the original M.A.I.D. legislation only 4.5 years ago. She questioned the current Justice Minister on removing the reflection period, given removing the safeguard was not called for in the Truchon decision. So the person who brought forward this legislation 4.5 years ago is saying, whoa, 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 why are we removing this? And yet we received no firm answer from this Liberal government of why that is. So I just found that pretty compelling. And so the Liberals, for really reasons unknown, went far beyond what was required in the case when they created Bill C-7. And I believe these concerns are valid. In fact, we learned in the first annual report on medical assistance in dying in Canada 2019, it stated that 3.6% of patients who made written requests for M.A.I.D subsequently withdrew those requests. Now, 3.6% may not sound like a lot, but of the 7,336 people who applied for M.A.I.D, 263 of them changed their minds. And keep in mind, M.A.I.D is new in Canada and not easily accessible everywhere. Imagine how many people will be applying for this after Bill C-7 passes. And as M.A.I.D becomes increasingly normalized, we know that the 263 lives that were allowed to continue to live on because of that reflection period, that is so important that we maintain that, in my opinion. But it won't exist moving forward because of this Liberal government's refusal to listen. Conservatives also proposed an amendment that would extend the new 90-day reflection period for those seeking M.A.I.D whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable. We proposed to extend it to 120 days. And the arguments for this are solid. As the 1,000 plus doctors that I quoted earlier said, they said, quote, "We live in a country where the wait times to see a psychiatrist in certain areas is 4 to 8 times longer than the 90-day waiting period proposed in this bill for those whose natural death is not considered reasonably foreseeable," end quote. Further, we know that after catastrophic accidents causing life-altering injury, for example, we know that suicidal ideation is very common, but with the proper support, it goes away and a happy and purposeful life can resume. Moreover, it takes much longer in many cases to get a wheelchair or quality specialized rehabilitation care than 90 days. So really, what good is 90 days if you're not able to access alternatives in that time period? I don't know. Additionally, Conservatives believe we can better protect vulnerable patients by requiring the patients to be the one who first requests information on medical assistance in dying and not have it openly or flippantly offered to a patient as a standard everyday option like pain medication or various therapies. Conservatives believe M.A.I.D is an extremely serious matter and should not be something pushed on patients in their most vulnerable state, so to speak. And now, whenever members on this side of the House state the potential for pressure to be put on patients concerning M.A.I.D, I do find during these debates that Liberal members essentially roll their eyes, they scoff and say that never happens. And while the Justice Committee heard something very different, they heard firsthand from witness accounts that pressure does in fact happen and has been happening over the past 4.5 years. Roger Foley is an infamous example of this pressure. He was offered M.A.I.D on 4 separate occasions to date and never once indicated that he was interested, in fact, quite the opposite. But when he was having a bad day, it was offered to him, and almost as if they were tempting him with saying, hey, there's an easier way, just end it all. And I just find that terrifying. And I find Roger's case further very alarming, and safeguards must be put in place to ensure that when people are at their weakest and most vulnerable moments, they're not offered something that would end their lives forever, but rather are provided various options for better care and support if they want it. Another issue I have with this bill, Madam Speaker, is that it moves to expand M.A.I.D so quickly. Really, this M.A.I.D legislation, the original framework, was just legalized 4.5 years ago, which is really a blink of an eye in relative terms. And the original legislation was thoroughly researched and vetted, and numerous safeguards were put in place to ensure our most vulnerable were protected, and those safeguards were considered critical at the time. But now, less than 5 years later, the Liberal government is massively expanding M.A.I.D and doing away with many of those safeguards it itself deemed critical in the first legislation not even 5 years ago. And at this pace, I very much believe and I fear that we may be debating expanding M.A.I.D for children or those with mental health issues within my lifetime, and I find that absolutely terrifying. And more than that, this legislation comes before the mandatory 5-year review. I feel that without it, we're flying blind without the proper data that could have been revealed in a comprehensive review. There are simple questions I would have hoped would have been assessed in that review, such as who is taking M.A.I.D? Is it mostly the elderly or the poor? Is it racialized communities, wealthy or white people? Is M.A.I.D impacting certain demographics, and why those demographics? Are there reoccurring themes for choosing M.A.I.D that could be addressed by providing better care during suffering and end of life, rather than death? We should be doing everything we can as legislators to provide alternatives to M.A.I.D that are reliable and easily accessible to everyone. And yet this government is not doing that at all. What I find interesting on this, Madam Speaker, is that the current Liberal Justice Minister is responsible for this aggressive expansion of M.A.I.D., but he in fact voted against his own government's Liberal legislation on M.A.I.D., the original one 4.5 years ago, because he believed it didn't go far enough. So we have known for a long time what his position was, and for me that leads me to question whether the Liberal consultations on this bill were really impartial, and may explain why this legislation goes far beyond the Quebec Superior Court judge, what she had called for in the Truchon ruling. And there are so many questions with this new freedoms Canadians have with M.A.I.D. I firmly believe we have the responsibility as legislators to proceed on ending life of Canadians with extreme caution. There is a profound shift happening in our society concerning M.A.I.D., and we must proceed thoughtfully and with thorough, exhaustive research, which has not happened with this expansion of M.A.I.D. And for me, this expansion, really to put it plainly, is too much, too fast, too soon. Bill C-7 removes other critical safeguards as well, Madam Speaker, such as removing the requirement to have 2 independent witnesses sign off on M.A.I.D. for a patient. This safeguard helped to prevent abuse and coercion of M.A.I.D. and provided much-needed oversight on those discussions with patients. And to think really a person needs 2 independent witnesses to sign off on a will, but not to end their actual life, which I feel like we're living in the twilight zone on that one. Further, Conservatives have advocated for amendments that would ensure physicians who sign off on the M.A.I.D. application have expertise in a patient's condition. And now you would think that a life-ending decision like M.A.I.D., that this safeguard would really be a given, but nope, the Liberals would disagree, and again, for reasons largely unknown. Additionally, I have heard a number of constituents reach out to me with significant concerns, that healthcare professionals who don't agree with the morality of M.A.I.D. would be forced to help administer it. Now, the Liberals have insisted that this will not be the case and that conscious rights of healthcare professionals will be protected. However, communication on that has been dismal, to say the least, and otherwise I would not be receiving so many calls about it, and I urge this Liberal government to invest more time and energy into communicating on this specific issue. And just to conclude, Madam Speaker, from the 1,000 doctors, or over 1,000 doctors that I've been quoting throughout my remarks, I will end with one of their quotes. They said, quote, "Our profession has been coerced into facilitating suicide rather than preventing it for ever-increasing number of citizens. We watch in utter dismay and horror at how the nature of our medical profession has so quickly been destroyed by the creation of misguided laws. We, the undersigned, declare that the passage of Bill C-7, if left unchecked, will contribute to the destruction of much more than our medical profession, but fundamentally of a Canadian society that genuinely values and cares for its most vulnerable Canadians. Canadians deserve better." End quote. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Louis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened intently to the member's speech. I myself am a strong advocate for palliative care. I was a founding member of the All-Party Committee on Palliative and Compassionate Care, and I have the largest palliative care hospice in the country in my riding, the Teresa Deller Palliative Care Residence. The member mentioned that the Minister of Justice voted against the original bill, but the reason he did was because he knew from the start that it was unconstitutional, precisely because he did understand the jurisprudence, which makes me think that the leader of the opposition was being rather glib when he suggested that the Minister of Justice didn't understand the jurisprudence. But the member mentioned that people should be allowed to sleep on it. But prior to the 10-day waiting period, there's an assessment period when people are obviously reflecting on the matter. So I just don't understand how it is that she feels by taking away the 10-day waiting period that people aren't allowed to or are not being given the chance to sleep on it.
Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the member's remarks, and I appreciate that he has phenomenal palliative care in his riding, and I wish the rest of the members of Parliament in this House could say the same. And had the members' Liberal government delivered on their 2015 promise to invest billions in palliative care, that may be the case in more ridings than his own. And to his question concerning the 10-day reflection period, again, I still believe it's very important that when that final decision is made, you still have to sleep on it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments for Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I've been here through the 5 years listening to a great deal of discussion and debate on this very important issue. All lives are of equal value. I genuinely believe that. Yes, we do need to emphasize how important personal care, home care, palliative care are. I've enjoyed that discussions. There's been money that's been flowing in that area. But my question to the member is, will the Conservative Party be transparent and honest with Canadians by making the statement as to the real reason why they're not prepared to see this bill go forward? They do not support the legislation, and they would rather have it appealed to a superior court. And if they were in government, they would not be passing this legislation at this point because they would have referred it to a superior court.
The honourable member for Kildonan and St. Paul.
The member opposite is correct. We would have appealed it to the Supreme Court. When we're talking about life and death, something at this magnitude that's going to be this change, this much change for society should absolutely go to the highest court in the land. End of story.
Exactly.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for a very thoughtful speech. I know that this issue is one that engages the most profound issues of conscience, and I think it requires great care as legislators. I remember the Carter decision when it came out, and I read it carefully, and I'm a lawyer as well by training. I was concerned when the government put in a requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable, because that was not called for in the Carter decision. And of course, that led to the plaintiffs in the Truchon decision, Nicole Gladue and Jean Truchon, to appeal. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning why they did so. Ms. Gladue was 74. She used a wheelchair. She had post-polio syndrome, a condition that weakened her muscles and reactivated her childhood scoliosis. She had difficulty breathing and was in constant pain. Mr. Truchon was born with cerebral palsy. He no longer had the use of his 4 limbs. He lost the use of his only working limb in 2012, his left arm, due to severe spinal stenosis, which left him almost completely paralyzed and caused painful spasms. He had given up most of his activities and went into assisted living since there was little left he could do by himself. Each of those people had been refused M.A.I.D under the Quebec legislation regarding end-of-life care, and they didn't meet the requirements of the federal legislation because their lives were not reasonably foreseeable. To my honourable colleague, does she agree with the Truchon decision insofar as it has found the requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable to be a violation of Canadians' constitutional rights?
The honourable member for Kildonan and St. Paul.
I appreciate the member's thoughtful comments, and I would say that I would have loved to have heard what the Supreme Court would have said about the Truchon decision. That would have given me more confidence in that decision. But ultimately, the reasonably foreseeable, removing that does give me some fear, and I was very frank about that in my speech. I wonder very much that in my lifetime, are we going to see this expanded to children who don't have reasonably foreseeable deaths, or those suffering from mental health? And that mental health piece, and I know the government's been very clear that this legislation excludes it, but at the rapid pace we're expanding it, I'm not convinced that within my lifetime we're not going to see this extend to mental health, and that I find to be the most terrifying of this new legislation.